There was a time when his face was everywhere, plastered across bedroom walls, lighting up television screens in living rooms from New Jersey to Nebraska. That jaw, those eyes, that voice that somehow managed to sound both young and ancient at the same time. Teenage girls wept over him. Magazine covers begged for him. Hollywood threw open its gilded doors and said, "Come in, stay forever." And he did what you do when the world hands you a crown at 21. He wore it. But here is what no one was asking, what no one thought to wonder. What happens to a man built for stardom when the stardom starts to crumble? What does he carry in the silence between the scenes? And what does it cost, truly cost, to smile for the camera while your life is quietly breaking in places no one can see? James Wesley Vanderbeek was born on March 8, 1977 in Cheshire, Connecticut, a small New England town where the winters are long and the expectations are quiet. His mother Melinda was a dancer. His father James managed a telephone company. There was nothing particularly cinematic about the house on Prospect Street. Nothing that would make you point at the blue-painted shutters and say, yes, that is where a star was made. And yet something was already flickering inside this boy. Something restless and radiant. Something that needed an audience the way a fire needs oxygen. He began performing at 6. Community theater, school productions, anything that put him in front of people and let him pretend to be someone else for a little while. His mother drove him to rehearsals with the quiet devotion that only a parent who truly sees their child can sustain. And what she saw was this: her son, standing on a stage no bigger than a living room, already commanding the room, already filling it with something you cannot teach. But before the stages came the hallways, and the hallways were not kind. James was a big kid, broad-shouldered, tall for his age, with a jaw that would later become iconic, but in middle school just made him look different in all the ways middle school punishes you for. He was bullied, badly, the kind of bullying that leaves marks on the inside of a person, the kind where you learn to walk slightly sideways through a world that seems designed to remind you that you do not quite fit. He has spoken about it in interviews over the years with that particular careful quietness of someone who has made peace with something but has not forgotten its weight. There was one incident, a hallway, a shove, laughter echoing off the lockers, that he has described as the moment he understood what it felt like to be truly alone in a crowd. That hallway. Remember it, because James Vanderbeek would spend the next 30 years either running from it or returning to it, depending on the day. He found his way to Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, where he studied English and theater and discovered that the stage was not just a place to escape, it was a place to become. He was 19 when the auditions started in earnest, 20 when the phone rang with the kind of news that rearranges the furniture of your entire life. Kevin Williamson had written a show called Dawson's Creek. It was about teenagers on the water's edge of a South Carolina town, filled with the kind of dialogue that was too smart and too emotional for its own good. They needed a lead. They needed a young man who could carry both beauty and vulnerability in the same breath. They found James Vanderbeek. The show premiered on January 20th, 1998. Dawson Leary walked into American living rooms and never really left. The ratings were staggering. The cultural impact was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, James was not just an actor. He was a symbol. He was the sensitive, thoughtful, sometimes infuriating boy that a generation of young people recognized as a version of themselves or a version of who they wished they could be. The WB network built its entire identity around him. Merchandise, magazine covers, the kind of relentless celebrity machinery that chews through human beings with a smile on its face. And here is where you have to slow down and really look. Because behind the perfectly lit photographs, behind the red carpets and the carefully composed answers to carefully composed questions, was a 21-year-old from Cheshire, Connecticut, who still remembered the hallway, who still carried that boy inside him, who was now being asked to be everything for everyone and had no real roadmap for what that cost. The show ran for 6 seasons. 6 years of his life, lived inside Dawson Leary's flannel shirts and existential monologues. 6 years of being recognized everywhere he went, of losing the private ordinary texture of daily life, of having his face be public property before he had fully decided what his own face meant to him. By the time Dawson's Creek ended in 2003, James was 26 years old, and the question that would haunt the next decade of his life was already forming in the air around him. Who are you when you are no longer him? The answer, it turned out, was complicated. The years after Dawson's Creek were the years Hollywood does not make movies about. No dramatic fall, no single catastrophic moment. Just the slow, grinding erosion that happens when the wave that carried you crests and begins, imperceptibly, to recede. He took roles. He made films. He tried to build a career that existed in the space beyond nostalgia. But the industry has a long memory and a short imagination, and what it remembered was a boy with a creak and a dream sequence and an expression of perpetual yearning. What it could not quite imagine was what he might become. He turned 30. He turned 35. The auditions became more complicated. The parts became smaller, or stranger, or simply absent. He moved through the industry with a quiet dignity that anyone who has watched a talented person navigate a narrowing corridor will recognize immediately. He did not complain publicly. He did not perform his disappointment for cameras. He absorbed it, the way you absorb things when you grew up learning to walk sideways through a world that doesn't quite make space for you. But in 2015, James Van Der Beek did something that required a different kind of courage than standing in front of a camera. He opened up, slowly, carefully, in the way of a man who has chosen his words with great precision, about the years of sexual harassment he had experienced in the entertainment industry. He spoke about men in positions of power who had targeted him when he was young and new and vulnerable. He spoke about the silence that surrounds these experiences, the way the industry's architecture of power makes speaking up feel like an act of professional suicide. He spoke about it not with bitterness, but with the particular steady grief of someone who has lived a long time with something heavy and decided that the weight of silence is finally heavier than the weight of the truth. That moment, that choice to speak, it reframed everything, not just the public understanding of who James Van Der Beek was, but his own understanding of himself. He had spent so many years being defined by what he had made, by Dawson, by the creak, by the television glow of a generation's memory, and here he was, finally being defined by what he had survived. And he was not finished surviving. In November of 2023, James Van Der Beek revealed something that stopped the world, or at least the corner of it that still carried his name in its heart. He had been diagnosed with colorectal cancer. He was 46 years old, with 5 children and a wife he loves, with the kind of uncomplicated, open devotion that people who have been through real things sometimes find on the other side of the complicated things. And here, in this diagnosis, in this new and terrifying hallway, was the real story, the one that nobody could have written, the one that makes every previous chapter look like preamble. He did not hide it. He told people. He posted about it. He spoke with the same careful honesty that had characterized his most authentic public moments. And what he said, stripped of everything, was this: I am scared, I am fighting, and I believe I am going to be okay. That moment, that choice to speak, it reframed everything, not just the public understanding of who James Van Der Beek was, but his own understanding of himself. He had spent so many years being defined by what he had made, by Dawson, by the creak, by the television glow of a generation's memory, and here he was, finally being defined by what he had survived. And he was not finished surviving. In November of 2023, James Van Der Beek revealed something that stopped the world, or at least the corner of it, that still carried his name in its heart. He had been diagnosed with colorectal cancer. He was 46 years old, with 5 children and a wife he loves, with the kind of uncomplicated, open devotion that people who have been through real things sometimes find on the other side of the complicated things. And here, in this diagnosis, in this new and terrifying hallway, was the real story, the one that nobody could have written, the one that makes every previous chapter look like preamble. He did not hide it. He told people. He posted about it. He spoke with the same careful honesty that had characterized his most authentic public moments. And what he said, stripped of everything, was this: I am scared, I am fighting, and I believe I am going to be okay. This is what the hallway made him. This is what all those years of being looked at without being seen prepared him for. The capacity to turn pain outward into something that reaches other people in their own dark corridors. By the time you reach your 70s, or the 70s you are approaching, with whatever mixture of peace and reckoning a human life accumulates, the question changes. It is no longer who will you become. It is what did it all mean? And for James Van Der Beek, the meaning seems to be gathering itself around something very simple and very hard: presence. The practice of being here, fully, in the body you have been given, in the moment that is actually happening, with the people who are actually beside you. He has spoken about wellness, about the radical reevaluation that a cancer diagnosis forces upon every assumption you have made about time, about the way illness strips the decorative layers off of life and leaves you standing in front of the essentials, which turn out to be fewer and more important than you thought. He has spoken about the way his children look at him, about what it feels like to know they are watching how their father moves through fear. He is moving through it with his eyes open. He is not performing courage. He is practicing it, the way you practice anything that matters, imperfectly, daily, without guarantee. There is a creek in Wilmington, North Carolina, where they filmed Dawson's Creek all those years ago. The actual location, the actual water, golden in the late afternoon light, surrounded by marsh grass that moves in the coastal wind with a sound like whispered conversation. If you stood there today, you could almost hear the echoes, the director's call, the splash of a young man's footsteps, the particular quality of silence between takes when the cameras are not rolling and the human being inside the character has a moment to simply breathe. That creek is not just a location, it is the place where a boy became a symbol, and a symbol began the long work of becoming a man. Now let me speak to you directly, because that is where this story has always been going. You have been watching this screen, listening to this voice, following the arc of a life that looks very different from yours in its specifics and probably very similar in its essentials. You have your own hallway, you know what I mean. The place where something happened to you that the world did not see, the moment that left a mark no camera ever caught. The thing you have been carrying in the same way you carry your keys, automatically, habitually, barely aware anymore of its weight. James Van Der Beek stood on red carpets and smiled for cameras while carrying that weight. He signed autographs and gave interviews and maintained a public face, while his private face was working through things that public faces are not supposed to show. He lost pregnancies and grieved them. He survived harassment and stayed silent for years before deciding the silence was too costly. He watched his career shift and contract and reshape itself around a changing world and a changing sense of what he was for. And then, when he was 46, he sat down with a diagnosis and had to decide, again for perhaps the 1,000th time in a life full of these decisions, whether to keep going. He kept going. Not because he is exceptional, not because fame inoculates you against despair or because growing up in Connecticut gives you some secret reservoir of resilience. He kept going because that is what humans do when they still have something to fight for, and he has 5 names for what he is fighting for, and a wife who is standing beside him, and a faith that does not ask for certainty but only for the willingness to take the next step. The creek is still there, the water still moves, the marsh grass still whispers in the wind. Here is what I want to leave you with. And it is not a conclusion, because lives do not conclude. They continue and complicate and surprise us right up until the very end. Think about the thing you have been running from, or the thing you have been carrying, or the version of yourself that you left behind in some metaphorical hallway years ago. Think about what it would mean to stop walking sideways through the world and start walking forward through it instead. Think about what James Van Der Beek chose, not once, but over and over again, which was to be honest about the pain instead of performing the painlessness. You have a creek too, you know what it is. The place where something started in you that has never fully finished. The place you return to in your mind when the nights get long and the weight gets heavy and you are trying to remember what you are actually made of. What would it look like if you went back there? Not to escape, but to reclaim something you left behind. What would change if you stopped letting the hallway define the direction?